Hi class! Welcome back to Ceramics 101 with Miss Terra. Today we're going to be talking about the different stages of clay. There are different terms for different stages of clay, both when it's in its unfired state and in between different firings. So today's lesson will be broken up into two parts. Okay, on to part 2 of the lesson of stages of clay. So now that you know the different stages of clay in the raw state, let's talk about the different names for the processes of firing that clay. So we begin with greenware, which is unfired raw clay, also known as bone dry. So just to reiterate, at the bone dry stage, clay is super fragile, and sometimes it can actually be easier to let it dry on a piece of like kiln shelf that you can put directly in the kiln rather than trying to handle a piece that has, say, really spindly legs. An important consideration of greenware is that clay needs to dry really slowly and evenly to prevent cracks and warping. That's why I often cover my pieces with recycled plastic bags as they dry. I have a water mister that I sometimes spray onto the edges when it's not reached bone dry yet to make sure that it dries slowly and evenly. If your piece is pretty even throughout and you don't have any like sculptural pieces or attachments, like making these little bowls, they don't really need to dry slowly because they're pretty even. But anything bigger or that has a handle or decorations or varying thicknesses needs to go slow. Now your clay is not finished at this point, far from. It still would dissolve in water, so if you tried to fill this up and use it as a cup, you'd have a muddy mess and it would be gross. But that does mean that you can clean up the surface a little bit if you want to using a damp sponge. Just be really gentle and delicate with it. So once your piece is bone dry and considered greenware, it's ready to be fired to the bisque temperature. And don't worry, I'll go over firing in the future. I just want you to understand the terminology for now. So after bisque firing, the clay will become very porous. All of the organic material in it will have burned out, as well as any water that is trapped on a molecular level. There is a reaction that takes place with the heat that creates a totally different texture of clay, and it's pretty awesome. After bisque firing, your piece may shrink a little bit. It'll be a little bit more lightweight, and it'll be really porous. I've also found that a lot of white clays take on a little like hint of pink that won't be there in your finished firing, even though it's sometimes kind of a pretty color. This is a bisque fired piece. You can hear it sounds, it has a certain sound to it. I don't know how to describe it, but it's more stable than greenware. It's also a little bit stronger than greenware, however it is still fairly fragile because it hasn't reached top temperatures yet. But now the clay will not dissolve in water, which means that that porous surface is perfect for glazing. This is also a great time to decorate with underglazes if you didn't at the greenware step. I like to layer a lot of color and detail onto my work, so I often create a piece that's maybe a little fragile, fire it to the bisque temperature, paint it with underglaze, and then fire it to the bisque temperature again to fix that underglaze before I glaze it. This is an example of that. Here is a bee cup that I've been working on, and I didn't want to try painting it when I knew that pieces like right here would be really, really delicate and I would probably break them. So I bisque fired it, now I've painted underglaze on it, and I'll bisque fire it again and then I'll glaze it. And then, of course, the last stage is glazed, when the clay has reached maturity, which means that you've fired it to the cone that that specific clay was designed for. Remember when we talked about cones? So for low fire clay, the clay will still be porous. It will not be watertight. It will not be food safe unless you apply a glaze. And then those areas will be watertight and food safe. But if you work in mid-range or above, then the piece will have fully vitrified, which means turned to stone. It will become impermeable, watertight, food safe, and much more durable. This final firing is where you see the most shrinkage in your clay, and how much shrinkage totally depends on the kind of clay you're using. I use porcelain, which has very fine particles, and it has one of the higher shrinkage rates of about 10%. Other clays that have grog in them or that are formulated differently might not shrink quite as much. But keep that in mind when you're designing your pieces, because if you make a mug that's the perfect size when it's greenware, it's probably going to be too small by the time it's gone through firing. So you always want to make things a little bit bigger than you think they need to be. Not only does the clay reach maturity, but the glaze you use also needs to reach maturity. That means that it has become glossy or matte or whatever texture that glaze is supposed to be, but it's not chalky, it doesn't wash or rub off, and it's bonded permanently with the ceramic base. To give you a little example, here's a cute little acorn sake cup I made. And this glaze was meant to be glossy, and it is. And this glaze was meant to be more matte, and it is. And that doesn't mean it hasn't reached the right temperature, it just means it was formulated to be a different texture. But both of these glazes are fully matured and are now watertight, food safe, etc. And when you do fire to temperature, your pieces will come out much stronger, which is good because you want, durability in your ceramic work. So like I said, I'll be going over how to fire and load a kiln and all of that stuff later. But for now, I really want you to focus on that first half of this class, the difference between wet and bone dry and the fact that it's a spectrum. I often like to work a little bit to this wetter side of leather hard. For some applications, it's better to work on the slightly drier side of leather hard. And so my mission for you this week, should you choose to accept it, is to make a bunch more of those pinch pots that we learned in the last class, and just try playing with them at different stages of dryness. Try carving into them with a pencil or a skewer or any tool you can find laying around the house. See what happens if you try to smush them into a ball or crush them. This is all about experimentation. And any pieces that remain intact after you're done playing with them, save them. We'll use them for glaze testing later. But for now, really focus on getting to know your clay and how it behaves between that wet and bone dry. Just don't carve it when it is bone dry. That is a health hazard, and I will be addressing that soon. If you're an obsessive note taker and you didn't have enough time during the video or you couldn't see all of the board, I'm just going to get out of the way for a second. You can pause it and take notes if you want to. Okay, I'm back. Hope you've enjoyed this class and it's helped you understand working with clay a little bit more. As always, I do these videos purely on a donation basis, so if you enjoyed them and you want to help me make it so I can make more, send me a little tip through Venmo, PayPal, or Patreon. Okay class, get practicing those pinch pots, try carving them at different levels of dryness, get to know your clay, and next week I'll be talking about some really important safety information before we go into testing glazes and firing kilns and making actual projects. Alright, I'll catch you next time.